Thank you very, very much, Dr. McRae, for that very warm and extravagant introduction. It touched my heart. Thank you very, very much. It is a great honor for me to stand here on this occasion and to present to you the first of 4 lectures in this series. I've always been honored in being invited back to Acadia. I can think of few things in my life that I cherish more than Acadia. It nurtured me during a very formative period of my life, and there will always be a warm spot in my heart for this environment. I'm delighted to see several of you whom I know and look forward to meeting others whom I don't know. One of my professors, Professor Lovesey, is here, the one that I see here. And I remember the Greek classes and the New Testament classes with much delight. I could name several others, but I will not do that at this moment. The purpose of these lectures is to clarify the nature of the many theological and ethical dilemmas that arose when Africans on the continent and in the diaspora encountered Christianity. More specifically, I propose, 1, to demonstrate that important continuities of thought and practice exist between African Christians in the diaspora and African traditionalists on the continent. And 2, I propose to argue that the African appropriation of Christianity, both on the continent and in the diaspora, evidences a complex amalgam of religious and moral values drawn from the African and the Western cultural contexts. Now, these lectures are based on 3 closely related assumptions. 1, that the attitude of European and North American Christendom towards the slave trade and slave ownership between the 15th and early 19th centuries was strikingly similar to that of traditional African cultures. 2, that the Christian missionary movement between the mid-19th and mid-20th centuries was intricately tied up with the colonial movement of European and North American imperialism. And 3, that until the 1960s, the whole of Western scholarship, both secular and religious, was permeated with a chauvinistic perspective that viewed all non-Western cultures as containing little or no value, and all non-Western religions as false. Now, scholars have always agreed that religion permeates every dimension of African life. In spite of their many and varied religious systems, the ubiquity of religious consciousness among African peoples constitutes their single most important common characteristic. And thus, John S. Mbiti, to whom I am greatly indebted, claims that secularity has no reality in the African experience, and that this is affirmed by virtually all religious scholars of African religion. He says, wherever the African is, there is his religion. He carries it to the fields where he is sowing seeds or harvesting a new crop. He takes it with him to the beer parlor or to attend a funeral ceremony. And if he is educated, he takes religion with him to the examination room at school or in the university. If he is a politician, he takes it to the parliament. Although many African languages do not have a word for religion as such, it nevertheless accompanies the individual from long before his birth to long after his physical death. End of quote. Contrary to the opinions of their predecessors, contemporary scholars of African religion generally agree that all peoples throughout the continent of Africa believe in a self-existent supreme deity who, as an African scholar claims, is believed to be responsible for the creation and maintenance of heaven and earth, of men and women, and who also has brought into being divinities and spirits who are believed to be his functionaries in the theocratic world, as well as intermediaries between mankind and this self-existent being. It is generally agreed among contemporary African scholars that this supreme deity constitutes the cohesive force in African cosmological thought that unites the natural, the historical, and spiritual realms of existence. Such a view implies a rejection of polytheism, because all other divinities within the African pantheon are thought to be derivative from and dependent on this one supreme being. In other words, African peoples believe that their numerous divinities, along with all other existent reality, whether spiritual or material, emanates from the supreme being. And hence, they have no independent existence of their own. And that puts to death the idea of polytheism, which would suggest that all of the various divinities are on the same level and therefore having independent existence. Not so. Thus, in contrast with the predominant views of many theologians of Christian mission, these contemporary African scholars describe a distinct monotheism at the heart of African traditional religion. More importantly, they argue that this traditional African theological understanding shares much commonality with Christian monotheism. In fact, many continue to challenge Christian theologians to reassess their assumptions about the uniqueness of the Christian deity and to acknowledge that God has revealed God's self authentically to many peoples other than the Jews alone. One major implication of this viewpoint is nowhere stated more sharply than in Mbiti's claim. He says, the God described in the Bible is none other than the God who is already known in the framework of traditional African religions. One desired impact of such a belief is to turn the entire Christian missionary enterprise on its head, since the latter's primary motivation and goal was to bring the true God to the Africans, as well as to all others whom they thought worshipped false gods. Mbiti and others strongly oppose this position. He says the missionaries who introduced the gospel to Africa in the past 200 years did not bring God to our continent. Instead, God brought them. They proclaimed the name of Jesus Christ, but they used the names of the God who was and is already known by African peoples. That is, one of the first things that missionaries had to do when they went into African cultures was to learn the language. And therefore they would ask the people, by what name do you call God? And the people then would say, Olodumare, or some other name. And then the missionary would say, well, we have come to tell you about Olodumare. And they said, how very nice, because we also know about Olodumare. And so already you have a basis of contact and a kind of communication that takes place. One of the most important marks of continuity between Africans on the continent and those in the diaspora is their mutual belief in a supreme transcendent God, primordially related to them as creator and preserver of all that is. And thus, when Albert Raboteau concludes, in the United States, the gods of Africa died, he is referring to the demise of the specific content of the African cosmological structure, its sacred symbols, its ritualistic practices, particular divinities, and the like. Now, as I've already implied, there is no evidence that either the slaves or their African forebears ever recognized the modern Western distinction between the sacred and the profane. Rather, both readily assumed a sacred cosmos. That is to say, traditionally, Africans thought of all reality, human and natural, animate and inanimate, as integrally related to a common primeval divine source, which alone was responsible for their continuing existence. Hence, they viewed everything as sacred in some respect, and they saw nothing as totally secular. Accordingly, African societies have produced extremely complex cosmologies in their many and varied attempts to explain and relate the spiritual, historical, and natural realms of human existence. Clearly, these traditional understandings are deeply rooted in the thought patterns of African peoples, such that their mental images, their concepts and beliefs and emotions are reflective of them. More importantly, the impact of modernity has not dissipated their power. Even among the most sophisticated contemporary urban dwellers, these traditional worldviews are revealed in such family and community rituals as naming ceremonies, marriage betrothals, funeral rites, reverence for elders, to mention only a few. Now, as with all peoples who are uprooted from their familiar cultures and transplanted to an alien environment, the African slaves brought their worldviews with them into the diaspora. They did not come here as tabula rasa. Though different in many respects, they all had one primary feature in common, namely their belief in the sacred nature of the cosmos. Thus, everything they thought and did reflected the sacred nature of the world. In other words, their cultural creations, their songs and music and dances and stories and art, etc., transcended any secular sacred classification split. Rather, they were considered relevant for the whole of life: work, play, music, and worship. It is interesting, if one goes to a so-called secular event in Africa today, one might hear the band playing something that you heard that morning in church or the morning before in church. There's no difference between secular music and sacred music. You can't tell the difference. That is, if it's in the African style. We do not doubt that the African slaves left their cultural artifacts on the continent. Yet we argue they brought with them across the seas their cosmological beliefs, from which they derived their communal and family values, spiritual devotion, and their moral codes. In spite of the many and varied proscriptions throughout the slavocracy against African cultural practices, and in spite of the massive pathological impact of 3.5 centuries of inherited chattel slavery, the acculturation of the Africans to their new environment did not result in a total loss of their religious and moral understandings. I repeat, did not result in a total loss of their religious and moral understandings. On the contrary, Africans in the diaspora were able to preserve the formal features of their most fundamental spiritual beliefs and moral values. This astounding accomplishment was due to their creative genius in making the Euro-American cultural forms, including Christianity, serve as vehicles of cultural transmission. This feat involved no small amount of imaginative skill and creative ingenuity. With respect to religion, however, their task was made easier by the structural similarities between Christian and African cosmologies. Thus, the conversion of Africans to Christianity, both on the continent and in the diaspora, did not mean the exchange of their indigenous religion for the new one, but rather an amalgamation of the two, made more possible by the common elements that were present in both. I realize I'm saying things that are quite controversial, and I'm looking forward to our discussions and talkbacks in order for you to have an opportunity to probe and to give your particular opinions. I'm saying very basically that there is a kind of amalgamation that has taken place between Christianity and traditional African understandings, and that both have influenced each other in different ways. For our purposes, it is not necessary to demonstrate the extent of the continuities between the two cultural contexts. It is sufficient only to show how the slaves inevitably brought their cosmological structure with them and creatively preserved it by incorporating many European and Christian elements into it, thus altering each in the light of the other. That is, the African cosmological belief being altered in light of the Christian contribution and vice versa. Now, we cannot overly emphasize the similarity between African and Christian theism. And as a person by the name of Blassingame has argued, the ease with which Africans, both on the continent and in the diaspora, could incorporate the Judeo-Christian deity into their African framework. In our judgment, this was the principal reason, not only for the success of the Christian missionary movement in Africa, but also its eventual expansion among the African slaves in North America. Genovese argues similarly. When Africans took over the Christian God, they simultaneously extended, rather than transcended, their own particularist practice. When Christian missionaries went to Africa, as well as to other foreign mission fields, they found it necessary to translate the Christian message into indigenous languages, which unwittingly constituted the first step in the process of enculturating Christianity into the indigenous cultural context. And this is where Christianity, Laman Sana writes about this at length, where Christianity differs from Islam, say, in that Christianity allows itself to be translated into other cultural contexts, such that the Bible is translated into thousands of different languages. But if you really want to become a Muslim, then you must learn Arabic, because the religion doesn't welcome and doesn't encourage its translation into other linguistic contexts. Ironically, this enculturation process did not have its origins in the post-colonial period of the 20th century, as many people presuppose, but rather at the beginning of the missionary enterprise. Interestingly, in many concealed ways, the slaves' gradual appropriation of Christianity involved a constructive process of translating Christianity into their African cosmological framework. Thus, in order to make Christianity their own and give their devotion to it, they had to Africanize it in much the same way as Christians in the Western world had westernized their faith. That is to say, they had to interpret Christianity through their own cultural forms. Now, due to the severe restrictions and proscriptions against the exhibition of any African cultural practices among the slaves, this Africanization process was largely confined to the internal life of the human spirit, which during the early period of slavery, the people shared with one another only in those secret places, in their homes sometimes, if they had homes, and in the other secret places where the slave owners could not hear them. Eventually, however, this internal process found external expression through the creative use of the oral tradition of music and song and sermons and prayers and testimonies and folklore. And this evidences the peculiar propensity of Africans, especially in religion, to retain inner values in spite of changes in their external conditions. Thus, as with language and other cultural expressions, African slaves turned many European and American cultural forms into receptors and conveyors of African religious and moral meanings. Evidence of this process is regularly being brought to light in the contemporary period by scholars in several different disciplines. The moral significance of the traditional African cosmology is similar to that of Christianity. As with the latter, that's with Christianity, African traditional thought views all value in general and moral value in particular as grounded in and derived from God. In Christianity, the normative sources of morality are the Bible, the church tradition, reason, and experience. In traditional African religion, the normative sources of morality are the tribal myths of origin, the oral tradition, the ritual practices of its priests, reason, and experience. As with the pre-Enlightenment period of the Christian era, traditional African thought and practice served to produce a people who were profoundly passive in the presence of authority. Virtually nothing in their cultural context encouraged criticism or dissent from religious authority. This state of affairs was reinforced by the belief that wrongdoing rarely issued from the top down, but rather always rose from some lower echelon. And accordingly, moral value was constituted by respect for and obedience to religious, political, and family authority, each of which in turn was viewed as derived from God the Creator and preserver of all things. I'm saying that on those things there is similarity between Christianity and African traditional thought. The African understanding of God as creator and preserver of all that is implies divine order and harmony, both in and among the spiritual, natural, and historical realms of existence. In the spiritual realm, that hierarchical relationship among the supreme deity, the divinities, and the ancestors is the paramount model of order and harmony, which African people seek to emulate in their own communities. Clearly, this view of authority and its implied obligations of respect, loyalty, and obedience have produced many societal constraints against dissent, which in turn has greatly influenced the way African peoples have responded to adverse conditions. On the one hand, Africans have a strong belief in predestination. And I'll say more about that in following lectures. That strong belief, on the one hand, has resulted in a propensity for simply adapting oneself to the situation in which one finds oneself. And this has tended to stifle creativity, criticism, and initiative. Yet, on the other hand, that same propensity to adapt contributed to the formation of a peculiarly patient and hospitable people with a strong sense of communal and family devotion. Further still, the totality of these virtues helped in the creation of a people highly skilled in the art of practical reasoning, due to the fact that all human activity was justifiable only insofar as it contributed to the preservation of order and harmony within the community. And so people were constantly called upon to justify their actions in terms of the contribution that their actions would make to the order and harmony of the community. And between the community, that is the historical community, and the spiritual community. We must add, however, that the divinities and the ancestors, these divinities are the sub-lieutenants, if you like, under God. The ancestors, and I'll say more about those in another lecture, were always viewed as spiritual protectors of the community. As with all hierarchical orders, the relationships within the order are characterized by an ethic of reciprocity. That is to say, those who are of higher rank are obligated to protect their subordinates, and the duty of the subordinates is to acknowledge their dependency by always seeking the goodwill and blessing of their superiors. It's much like the relationship between God and humans as we understand it. One, it's a reciprocal relationship, a covenantal relationship, about which, again, I will say more later. It is important, and in fact necessary, for humans to learn, in the African context, that their duties and obligations, their duties and obligations to the divinities and to the ancestors require diligence and faithfulness in their performance. In return for such devotion, the divinities and the ancestors can generally be relied upon to reciprocate in appropriate ways. That is to say, they will bestow blessings. But willful neglect in performing such duties can have devastating effects, not only on the individual, but on the community as a whole. Because mercy and compassion are not intrinsic attributes of either the divinities or the ancestors. That should give you just a little clue as to where Christianity might be making its contribution in this relationship in terms of introducing notions of mercy and compassion. Nevertheless, the effects of wrongdoing in the African framework can be neutralized through ritual practices under the direction of professional priests and priestesses. A further thing of moral significance needs to be stated at this point. Unlike Christianity and Islam, for example, traditional African religion tolerated different worldviews, philosophies, and religions. In large part, this was due to its belief in henotheism, that is, acknowledging a plurality of gods. This is not the same as polytheism. Consequently, traditional African religions did not claim possession of universal and absolute truth, and hence they had no warrant to proselytize other peoples. Also, in contrast with Christianity, as well as with Islam, traditional African religion did not constitute itself into institutional centers of authority and power. Rather, its organizational form was radically decentralized. Parenthetically, I think this may constitute an important reason for the preference of Africans in the diaspora for the free church tradition. Also, the African tradition was preserved by means of the dynamic medium of the oral tradition, rather than the more static form of writing, of a written tradition. Thus, the tolerance implicit in traditional African religions enabled their adaptation to new ideas, and hence there was no need for the birth of an Enlightenment age and its concomitant corpus of secular knowledge. This does not imply, however, the absence of conflict between traditional African society and modern African society. Rather, those two presently coexist in a way not dissimilar from the way neighboring tribal societies have coexisted from antiquity up to the present day. Now, I must say, however, that none of this is intended to deny the reality of African imperialism that was exercised for centuries over smaller tribal groups. Under all such conditions of conquest, traditional African religions provided spiritual reinforcement for their particular peoples, whether they were the conquerors or the conquered. In this respect, they were not unlike the way Christianity functioned under similar conditions. But unlike Christianity, the warrant for such conquest did not issue directly from their theological worldview, which gave them no mandate to evangelize the world. Nevertheless, legitimation was not achieved through conquest alone. Rather, it was necessary for the conquerors of any particular tribal group to legitimate their authority by interweaving their respective cosmologies with the cosmologies of the conquered group. And if they didn't do that, then they would have the seeds for considerable ongoing conflict. But it was through the amalgamative process that their conquest became legitimate, so to speak. Now, for several reasons, Africans in the diaspora gradually lost their identity. That is, the specificity of their tribal identity, and hence the specific substance of their tribal religions. But the structural elements of both became viable vehicles for new content. Accordingly, the specificity of tribal diversity was replaced by the newly discovered principle of racial unity that was designated by the symbol of Africa. It may be a surprise to you to learn that Africans originally did not have any concept of themselves as a race. And they never used any designations or ideas of race. When everybody is the same, then race is not really a factor. I would say similarly amongst European peoples, there was no concept of race until Europeans met people of other races. And then the race began to occupy a particular kind of space in human vocabularies. With the loss of tribal specificity in the slave context, then gradually the slaves began to adopt the term Africa and African as a way of pointing to their own identity. Africa, which wasn't an African term. I mean, Africa was a European name that was given to a certain continental mass. But this began to function as a symbol of unity for the African slaves, and particularly for those who were freed from slavery. And they began naming their organizations, in addition to themselves, as African peoples. And we have it right down to our very day in this very province in terms of the African United Baptist Association, which is connected with this long line of thinking. In the diaspora, the specificity of tribal diversity was gradually replaced by the principle of racial unity. And accordingly, the diversity of tribal parthenons and the plurality of divinities within each of them were gradually replaced by the African appropriation of the triune Christian God and what they considered to be the biblical ancestors. I must hasten to add, however, that this African appropriation of Christian theology implied a radical change of perspective from that of their Christian slaveholders. You see, it took, during the first 150 years of slavery, Africans rejected Christianity because they considered it to be the religion of their slave masters, and therefore containing no value for them. It was similar to them viewing other tribal groups as having their particular religions that was okay for them, but those religions had nothing to do with them. And so this line of thought was deeply rooted in the African understanding that a people's religion is synonymous with their way of life. And thus Christianity was thought to be expressive of the slaveholder's way of life, and hence the slave rightly rejected it. Now, it is beyond the scope of this lecture to give a detailed description of the process by which African slaves eventually made Christianity their own. Suffice it to say that the religious spirit that the slaves nurtured and promoted in various secret meetings was subversive in nature. That is, if they were caught in these secret meetings, they would have been severely punished. So they were already doing an illegal thing. But in fact, in those secret meetings, an alternative understanding of the Christian gospel was born and celebrated and proclaimed. Listen to this quote from a slave. Not being allowed to hold meetings in the plantation, the slaves assemble in the swamps out of reach of the patrols. They have an understanding among themselves as to the time and place of getting together. This is often done by the first one arriving, breaking boughs from the trees, and bending them in the direction of the selected spot. Arrangements are then made for conducting the exercises. They first ask each other how they feel, the state of their minds, etc. The male members then select a certain space in separate groups for their division of the meeting, preaching in order by the brethren, then praying and singing all around until they generally feel quite happy. The slave forgets all his sufferings, except to remind others of the trials during the past week, exclaiming, "Thank God, I shall not live here always." Then they pass from one another, shaking hands and bidding each other farewell, promising, should they meet no more on earth, to strive and meet in heaven, where all is joy and happiness and liberty. And as they separate, they sing a parting hymn of praise. Most of the songs used in worship are composed by the slaves themselves, and they describe their own sufferings. These songs have been called the spirituals. W.E.B. Du Bois called them the sorrow songs because they focused so much on the condition of suffering from which they desired liberation in their present life, the fullness of which they were certain in the life hereafter. These songs, more adequately called the spirituals, have been bequeathed to the world as a slave's legacy of spiritual triumph. They tell the story of suffering and of hope, of endurance and transcendence, of history and eternity. Written by unknown authors of long ago, they contain the substance of slave Christianity, God who is no respecter of persons, but rather the parent of all humanity, who wills that all should live in community as one family, honoring and respecting the dignity of all. Africans in the diaspora have long been convinced that this substance of slave religion is the authentic gospel of Jesus Christ. And accordingly, they viewed slave-holding Christianity as a moral and theological corruption. This authentic gospel centers on the parenthood of God and the kinship of all peoples under God. And since kinship among Christians implies the equality of persons in community, the kinship of all peoples under God implies opposition to those who threaten or destroy the equality of God's people. This Christian vision was born in slavery. It was protected in the so-called invisible churches, those secret spaces that emerged on the plantations in the secret meetings of the slaves, and those that were later institutionalized in the independent black church movement of Africans in the diaspora. Now, I must state here, before ending, that the more parochial understanding of a tribal God never completely vanished from the Africans in the diaspora. Rather, its continuing presence has been evidenced in various nationalist movements that have regularly emerged from one, as well as in various practices that can be located in various cities of North America and other places. Like their African forebears, Africans in the diaspora have continued being a religious people, believing that they live and move in close proximity with God, the comforter, protector, shepherd, and provider. In short, their belief in an ever-present divine resource capable of delivering them from any measure of trouble has been characteristic of this newfound faith. I think I'm going to end there. I wanted to go on to say a few things about the kind of theology that arose amongst the slaves under the title of survival theology, and how religion in the African context must serve the basic fundamental needs of the people. And so if one looks at the slave condition, it is important to see how the religion of Christianity that they had adopted for themselves, how it spoke to their basic and most fundamental needs. But we will get to that again. Thank you very much for being so attentive.